facing. So that's why we wanted to not to talk about only about COVID-19, but also talking about how our practice, our theories, and the tools we are using are transforming our daily practice in other opportunities and ways in the next future. For this, we invited Jeremy Thiel from Central Saint Martin. He's the head of Central Saint Martin. He's a writer, teacher, and a theorist, and of course, very well known for publishing some important theoretical book like Architecture Depends, Flexible Housing, and Nicolay Boyadjiev from Strelka Institute, that is an experimental way of having a sort of different way of having academia from Strelka Institute of Moscow, and is a and is also the head of our masters in architecture, construction, and the city. But is also the editor of Ardet, one of our magazine about architecture, design, theory. So I would like to leave the floor to Alessandro, especially trying and also asking all our colleagues to start from the contingency situation in our institutions. So what happened? What were the challenges and the question that raised during this period, but also what we have learned in a few months, and having a sort of roundtable discussion among us, sharing experiences and opinions. Of course, it's very open, this event, so we would like to invite some of the people that are connected online to raise some questions. We don't want to be so formal. We have 2 hours in really sharing our experiences, but also let's say some political and social issues that came up in this period.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo, for this presentation and introduction. I really thank Jeremy and Nicolay for being immediately available to this first discussion around this shocking experience we are living now, but we've just finished to experience in the last month, because from Torino especially, we have we were starting to have a sort of network around design practice involving you and other scholars around the world, and at the same time when we started to announce this new network, the COVID-19 arrived and closed all the opportunities to be connected, to go to China or to do other things that we were imagining at that time in February. So after a couple of months, everything has changed. It's changed so deeply, and now we are facing a new situation. Maybe this is one of the first occasions in which we can discuss with you and to try to be aware of our situation and comparing what were our means and strategies to deal with this exceptional and emergent crisis. Of course, the same initiative comes from a sort of bottom-up network made mostly by the young researchers, PhD students in our school, which is this Telearchitettura, which started to gather together the first fragment of lectures and other actions that we were producing and attending at the same time. So now we can try to share this. I mean, in this intermediate position between the proponents of this meeting and the host, let's say, because I'm directing one of the master program here in Politecnico, And so I can start just to say some issues about the questions we were trying to share with you about the tools, about the practice, and about the theory, which are the main axes from which we wanted to start for the discussion. Of course, the problem of the practical problem of how to deal with teaching, with remote teaching, especially around design topics and exercise, it's a very hard thing. But maybe it's not the only one. It's not the only aspect we want to deal with, because of course everybody of us started to redesign and rearrange the space, the web camera for, I don't know, for instance, I'm to dialogue with my students by using a pile of sheets and drawing on it, having a small camera on my hand, over my hand, and then exchanging with other issues. But I mean, this is interesting, but it's not so interesting. On the other side, there are other aspects that maybe are more involving how for instance, our studios are going on in this situation. Because for instance, now I'm finishing with 50 students a studio in which we try to exchange projects and to review them, and some of the students have been enough enthusiasts also to be challenged about this emergency, and others are more depressed instead. So how can are we really doing something which is comparable with what we were offering before or not? It's just a sort of bluff. We're trying to represent ourselves as a strong institution which is warranting everything, but maybe it's not real. How is this problem? This is a very serious problem. And then there is another problem, which is at the theoretical level, that is about the fact that we always propose a perspective when we teach, for instance, into an architecture studio, and we ask the students to be challenged by global challenges about society, about environment, about the policies of our cities. But in this case, the challenge was not just how to say, a simulation. The challenge was within the action, was within their own experience. So we are not just simulating. We are not just simulating something. We are living within our theories the challenges. So was these challenges contradicting our theories, or on the opposite, was it encouraging or enforcing what our theoretical positions was assuming before the crisis? This is the third question. And in my case, for instance, I would say that we wanted we worked actually on some islands in front of Venice, in the Laguna of Venice. And we wanted to deal with this place because it's a very strange place, very weak from the heritage point of view. It's not at the historical center of the city. It's more made by small houses, and there are some urban design problems. But we were very generic at the very beginning. We wanted just to focus on the heritage issues, and then when we started, we realized that we couldn't go there. We couldn't have the material experience of that place, and we have to deal with the problem of environment, as well as with the fact that maybe that place won't be visited by tourists again as it was before, and so on and so forth. And all these issues entered the projects, the students' project, and maybe it affected also the way we were proposing the topic around the exercise. But anyway, so the tools the material way you are organizing the teaching is the first point. The second is the practice, how you organize the interaction and in teaching and research about the space and the environment and the new virtual environment of your classrooms. And third, the theory and the ideological assumption, how they were affected by this crisis. I would say that this could be the three main points we can try to discuss together. Jeremy or Nicolay, as you prefer. The first one, Jeremy, maybe you can start.
Okay. You use the word crisis about 5 times, and I think that we've got to stop using the word crisis. What's happened is an inevitable conclusion to the ecological disruption that society, and particularly late capitalism, has inflicted on the world. So we better get used to it. And as long as we keep on talking about it as a crisis, then all we can do is to be in a state of reaction rather than a state of kind of proposition. And I think actually our students have moved quite quickly from saying, this is not a crisis, this is actually what we are going to engage with in the future, in quite a exceptional manner. And I think that I worry that COVID in particular, in seeing as a crisis of its own, in its own way, actually begins to deflect from the other forms of societal breakdown, such as race, such as climate, such as social inequality. And we need to see it much more as a kind of intersectional thing, where all of these things are an inevitable consequence of what mankind has inflicted on the world. So I think that's quite important, because otherwise we're only ever going to be in a state of reaction to the crisis. So that would be my first point.
Yeah.
And because of that, also, you said that students, and you're absolutely right in this, students are concerned about the comparability of what they're doing with what they've done before. And I've actually just come out of a student meeting, and we were talking about this, and I was saying, we've got to stop comparing to what it was like before, because what was like before will never be the same again. We will never retrieve the past. We will never retrieve the conditions under which we were previously working. And in a way, I think that's good. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. Well, I do. I have a problem with rising inequality in race and climate, but I don't have a problem that some of the things that we took for granted before, we won't be able to continue to take for granted. And therefore, the trouble with saying, for students who are comparing their work, which I completely understand, to what happened before, is they always think they're doing second best. Yeah, they always think that there's some kind of, it wasn't as good as what my previous students were doing. Whereas in fact, what they're doing now is much better on its own terms than anyone has done before, because no one has been in these conditions. So there's nothing to compare it with. So they must be the best, as it were. And now that sounds too easy for me to say as a kind of academic leader rather than doer. But I do think that some of the things that our students have been able to achieve in the last 3 months, through necessity, through reaction, through the condition which they're working under, has been quite exceptional in terms of dealing with contingency, in terms of dealing with extreme conditions, in terms of dealing with being agile. And those are exactly the qualities that are going to be needed in the future conditions. So the old conditions of certainty, the old conditions of refinement, the old conditions of a kind of rationality in the world are no longer with us. They've been ripped up. And therefore we're in new conditions, and these need new ways of thinking. And I think that what's been extraordinary in the last 3 months is how students and staff in the face of huge personal loss and huge personal suffering in many cases, have been able to adapt. And if we can start talking about these modes of adapting rather than reacting to crisis, I think that we'll be in a more positive condition. So that's my first response. Nicolay.
Nicolay, you just have to turn on your microphone.
Yeah,
okay?
sorry, I thought I wasn't muted. So yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, and also Jeremy, I completely agree with your starting point. In fact, since the beginning, we internally within our program and our project, we have been quite adamant about thinking of the situation less as a state of exception that is now again interpreted through the framework of a crisis, but really more as a kind of a revelation of things that were always true but are now simply made much more visible and much more apparent. So this kind of attitudes towards conditions that allow us to rediscover the real, what we called internally the revenge of the real. We applied as much, let's say, to the contents of our course load than to the structure and to the kind of a process as well. So this particular opportunity, this particular situation was really seen as a kind of a starting point to rediscover what we were already doing in terms of educational habits and formats rather than kind of reinventing it, at least in our case. I should also say that I completely agree that this context of uncertainty is one which would require adaptation. I'm personally not as concerned about the students as I am about institutions in general, education institutions in general, who are much less able to adapt to shifting circumstances than students or young practitioners who are at an early stage in their careers and therefore are not treating this, as you said, as something that they lost, but really as the de facto condition in which they have to operate. Institutions are not as lucky because they already operate on many inherited assumptions. And in a situation like this, they are the ones that are much more likely to topple than the students who, in fact, in many cases, may need the institution less than the institution need them in the first place. So this is just something to kind of bring in the conversation around the relationship between what we still refer to as students, whereas perhaps new labels could be required in this day and age.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy and Nicolay, for your answers. I think that yes, I also completely agree with what Jeremy said, and I was a little bit provocative when I was mentioning the crisis and the emergency, because I see that also here in Italy at every level, from the political national level to the local and to the institutional of our same university, there is a sort of instinctual reaction to the contingency in terms of emergency, because the state of emergency, of course, suggests an exceptional return to some kind of authority and sovereignty. So there is something new that has to be done immediately without mediation. And so there is a sort of Schmittian approach to politics at every level, which can be very dangerous also. So I think that transforming this state of emergency in a state of explicitation of something which was already happening before the last contingency we are living now, it's a challenge. It's a political and a practical challenge that we have to face. And so when you, Jeremy, say that we need new ways of thinking, new ways of dealing with this contingency, because there's nothing to compare, and we cannot retrieve something. We have to go further. We can go straight ahead of us. Maybe we have to think about new ways of being architects as well. So we have to, there's no any more excuses about this. The profession as we knew has finished to exist. I mean, there's a profession like the traditional one in some small islands, in some big cities of the world, maybe in London and in Moscow, not in Torino, in Milan, yes. You can be an architect in a very normal terms, but in the other places of this world, in most of the places of most of the cities of this world, in my opinion, we have to reinvent completely the profession and the practice of the architect. Not because we have to survive as a professional category, but because I think that we need architects. The architects could become something else. So what do you think about this? Do you agree with this? And if yes, how would you define the new architect, which is capable to go further and to deal with this contingency in a new way?
Well, Alessandro, you're just playing to me, aren't you? Because you know what I'm going to say, because you know all my work is about contingency. And so let me tell you one story, which is within a week of the announcement of all schools of architecture going online, the Royal Institute of British Architects wrote to all schools of architecture saying, yeah, it's tough you're having to go online, but the one thing you need to ensure is that you keep to the letter of the criteria that we have set you for validation. It was disgraceful. It was completely disgraceful that they had no sympathy, no empathy, and no sense of exactly what you've just said. That they saw the threat as existential, I think, and therefore their reaction was one of the law, that you have to abide by our laws. As I said back to them, if you actually look at the validation criteria which you set, and if you took seriously notions of climate and now COVID or inequality, you would fail those criteria. Because the criteria state the modern project of architecture, which means basically the modern project of architecture is expressed solely through the means of the building. So I think you're dead right, something has to change. And I've been giving a lecture called Architecture After Architecture, and that was before COVID, which Tatiana Schneider and I, it's a project we're doing together, which basically says, in the face of the climate emergency, all the fundamental principles of architecture are blown into little bits. The notion of extraction, the notion of the aesthetic, the notion of the technical solution, all of those become as of nothing. And what COVID has done is to accelerate that argument into something else. But I wouldn't, so I agree with you, of course, you knew I would agree with you, that's okay. You need to be nice to me. I don't know why, but you did. But I don't see this as negative. I see this as something quite interesting, because if the climate emergency and COVID as two interrelated ecological, we will use the word crises, because they are, at the level of ecology, it is critical, they are crises. They put the whole ecological system of the planet into a state of emergency. That is an emergency. If you then respond to that and say, actually what one needs is systemic societal, cultural, and economic changes, then each of those changes has an accompanying social formation and therefore spatial formation. So what is really interesting for me is that if these two conditions of climate and COVID will begin to lead us into new social scenarios, because they need to, then what I'm interested in are what are the spatial formations which accompany those social scenarios, and what is the role of spatial practice, not architects, I mean, architects are kind of half gone already. What is the role of spatial practice to contribute to the collective discussion around those new formations. So I would say, yeah, architecture as we've known it is probably semi-redundant already, but spatial practice as we may begin to imagine it has real possibilities. That's me.
If I can also, we have this kind of interesting, polite way of succeeding one another and agreeing. I'm sure at some point we will disagree, but I'll just continue with agreeing for now. In the sense of, I completely share the sentiment around this kind of nostalgia about a time that maybe never was around architecture, like architects with a capital A. It seems, at least to me, in my own architecture education, we were trained to kind of look at a very specific, possibly historical state of exception, you know, in a kind of early post-war era, and propping up a certain role for the architect with a capital A that is endlessly kind of lamented. Whereas perhaps that's either A, never was the case, or B, maybe is not that useful for a young generation of designers who are interested in the potential of, you know, space and spatial interventions, but are not necessarily that enamored with the label of an architect. My answer from the standpoint also of Strelka, where I teach, is actually Strelka is not really a school of architecture. It's an institute, let's say, of media architecture and design. Media, of course, preceding both other terms. And I should say that about we were very much interested in space and architectural and, like, let's say, design practice and the agency of design practice. But only about a third of our researchers are architects. And the reason for that is that if we take space or the city to be, you know, a relevant starting point for intervention for many of the kind of planetary scale problems that we face, architects have a lot to learn, obviously, from other disciplines and how they reinvent their own practice, but also other disciplines should equally be learning from the legacy of spatial thinking and professional training that our profession has had, and think of their own fields as a type of urban design practice. Like for a journalist, for a lawyer, for a software developer, they, the potential of us learning from them is equal, let's say, to the potential of them thinking of their own practice in those terms. And again, coming back to institutional design, if anything, the role of academic institutions at that particular time should be to respond to the state of, let's say, contingency by equally reinventing themselves and treating the institutional project as a design project in itself, which could also be the purview of architects. And this is definitely how we've been thinking about our own program, and possibly why we were maybe in a good position to be reacting quickly, given the fact that we did not have any types of criteria that we needed to respond to, because our team consists of 4 people and 30 researchers with a network of around 50 decentralized faculty that we invite either for remote lectures or for in-person 3 to 5 day workshops. So that particular project of education is a type of design project that could be seen as a relevant urban design project in the face of the current pandemic and in the face of the current possibly planetary predicaments.
Yes, no, I mean, thank you, because this is very interesting from the in terms of how can we imagine in the future to reform, to redesign our schools also about the teaching, design, architecture. What is intertwined within this bundle of competencies and practices that we usually offer to our students. And I think that both of you mentioned a broader range of actions and implications, which keeps the focus on something like the space, the special practice, and the institution also, and the fact that we can also design the institution and that maybe this agency of design practice is more multidimensional, dimensional than we were thinking before. Just few years ago, you can imagine that also in Italy, this approach to a different vision of architectural competences is slower because of many reasons. Also because we have a specific tradition in the mainstream architecture, which has completely failed in the last decades even. But we continue to deal with that. We continue to refer to that as a sort of mythology that should feed our schools, our identity, our legitimation, and it doesn't work anymore. So I am personally in the middle of one of these reforms of the school, because we are dealing formally with that, bureaucratically even, within our Athenaeum. So this, the three master programs of architecture at Politecnico di Torino are going to be changed again. So we are dealing with programs, with credits, and what is the profile of the students who will be graduated, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine how is important this kind of discussion for me and for the people from Torino, because of course we have the sensation that there's something it's not working anymore, also in this kind of promise that we offer to the student. So the next question to you would be this one, that what are we offering to the students? And now that we are teaching them through a video, we are talking to people that maybe are in another part of the world, and although they're paying the fee for being part of our institution at the same time. So this is a very, very pragmatic, very concrete issue. But we're saying, don't worry, I will teach you everything in any case, because you can follow me, you will make the exercise, you will receive all the information needed to become an architect. And so in this moment, something becomes very clear and very, and it's somehow frightening also, that it's the fact that we are offering just information, but maybe that's not what they want. That's not what they're paying for, because they want to stay in Moscow or stay in San Martin and meeting that kind of people, or having that kind of milieu, which is something that they're expecting, and maybe that is the main thing they're paying for. And we could even say that at MIT or at Tsinghua University, Torino or London or Moscow, teachers are equally good guys who knows a lot of things that can be exchanged through Zoom or other conferences, but that's not the fact. That's not the peculiarity, okay? Because everybody of us could be a good professor, because in terms of information, but it's not the same if you go to Boston or if you go to Rome or Moscow. It could change everything. So our capitalization and our offer is connected to something else, something which is even outer to our school. So how do we have now to explicit this? Do we have finally to come out and say, okay, let's admit that what we are offering and what you are paying for, it's not what we are declaring within our documents, within our institutional programs and syllabus. What do you think about this? Because it's a very delicate point for me.
Nicolay, you start this time. then I can disagree.
Yeah, I was planning to disagree, but okay, we can both disagree. No, actually, I would say that if we take that question quite literally, what are we offering? I think that a lot of academic institutions have to ask themselves that question in very pragmatic terms. I don't mean to, I mean, obviously, we're quite lucky and opportunistic here in our setup, because we're a little bit of a kind of a para educational institute, where since it's postgraduate education, and the average of our researchers is between 28 to 34 years old. Our students, quote unquote, are already quite knowledgeable. Like many of them actually teach in their own institutions, and we get to benefit from academics who are tenured elsewhere and invite them to actually teach short-term workshops with us, which means that we can actually afford not to charge tuition, but actually, like I said, offer a stipend, and therefore attract a group of 30 researchers who are not let's say not empty vessels that are hungry for knowledge from the professors to be poured in, but really, as we call our program, members of a think tank, of a cyclical think tank across 3 years. Them as a particular cohort, working with the faculty as also a different type of researchers, are generating content over the course of 3 years rather than learning, quote unquote. And I think the reason why I want to take this question literally is because I think more than methodology and more than kind of disciplinary strategies and so on, the socioeconomic constraints that academic institutions have to deal with, that kind of force students to take on almost criminal levels of debt in order to get out of school and essentially be forced into a pattern of getting any job that allows them to pay off that debt, or simply they could already afford it, and therefore it didn't really matter. I think this is something that institutions have to really get at the bottom of, and kind of rethink models of funding education for the staff, for the faculty, but also for the students, so that we can actually change this model where students see themselves as consumers, rightfully so, because they're paying such high fees. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's definitely something that comes to mind in my case when I hear about what are we actually offering these students.
I think it's a great question, I really do. And I hadn't thought about it, and I obviously need to think about it in clearer terms, because your sense that actually you could just have a great big minestrone of global activity in which, one piece of cabbage is the same as another piece of cabbage, is kind of quite upsetting. And yet it may be also the new reality. So how does one stop that? And I think that what your question really demands us to all articulate is what are our values? Because we are not simply instruments. We are not simply tools. We are not simply providing. I know that you were doing it on purpose, but we're not just there to be a person on a Zoom screen saying draw it like that. That's absolutely clear. The most extreme version of this is in the business school network, in which the Financial Times list of business schools in terms of the ratings is not dependent on any form of learning and teaching. It is simply the average graduate salary. So the average graduate salary is not based at all on what people learn in terms of information. It's simply based on cultural networks, the established cultural networks of the elite. Indeed, you might be taught in a business school semi-fascist values, and yet still, or maybe even because of learning semi-fascist values, you are going to be earning more money than the next person in the school doesn't teach semi-fascist values. So that this whole sense then of what we are providing is absolutely critical. So if I take St. Martin's, which has got the world's greatest fashion course, full stop, okay? They do learn amazing things about pattern cutting, about a kind of a legacy of amazing invention. But what they're really learning is to be together. They're really learning these kind of invisible networks of how they as a group of students are going to be the next greatest thing to come to fashion. We can't really teach them that as such, but that we can provide the networks and the environment and the context in which those networks, for better or worse, begin to develop. And you can't do those online. You simply cannot do those online because they depend on these strange, incidental kind of engagements, which are sometimes physical. You can replace some of it online. And I'm in a lucky position, and I think Nicolay's in a lucky position, and you are in Torino, in as much as you probably have something more specific in your institutions than some other less elite institutions. But it is the articulation of that. And in the bind that we're in at the moment, and I hope none of my students are watching this, but you know, at the moment, all of us are saying, we're not going to recompense, we're not going to give you back your fees, because we are still providing the education. And the proof of that is that we will pass you. Yeah, we will give you a degree. And shut up because you've got a degree. And that argument can survive once, but it can't survive continuously. And therefore we need to articulate exactly what we are offering beyond the basic online experience. In some cases, the online experience has been better than the offline. One of the things that we found is that the online experience has, in terms of teaching, allowed some silent voices to be more express. They use the chat function in Teams, they use, you know, a whole set of things where suddenly people who in a physical setting didn't feel confident about putting their hands up are actually coming in on the keyboard and being more articulate and as much as that, actually enjoying the space of the online. So that's good. I think that we need to be more intentional about what is good and what's bad about online. But I think, sorry? But I think also that we need to answer your question about what else are we offering in terms, and I have to say, I don't like to use the word cultural capital because that kind of puts it into a neoliberal framework, but we are offering a whole set of other networks, and which are physical as well as virtual. It's a good question there.
Can I add something to this, just in the spirit of conversation? I think in the current, like in the context in which this is all developed, because at least this has been our experience, because our researchers started off in person and were kind of let's say ripped apart by the situation, the motivation to continue to preserve a sense of community online is really what is driving them to continue this. I think it would have been a very different situation had they started virtually to begin with. Yeah. And I completely agree in terms of this conversation of like digital versus physical is completely as if it's 100% one way or the other, maybe sets the terms of the conversation in inaccurate way. Some things, of course, are better virtually, and some, in that context, the benefits of the physical interaction are even more apparent, because then you really realize what was the core function of the space that they share physically together with professors, with the network. And therefore you can start, as we started off with this conversation, rediscover what was valuable about these physical points of interaction through the emergency.
Yeah, Nicolay, I completely agree with that. I mean, the fact, I don't think there is a sort of opposition between the physical and the virtual environment of our interaction. I would prefer to say that somehow this situation in which we were compelled to act only virtually pushed us to become aware, to explicit exactly what you said, to explicit where is the value of what we are doing and where is the value of our schools and how is it distributed between the so-called infosphere and other spheres, for instance, the material space or the physical interaction among people. So I think that somehow the virtual, the obligation to stay virtual allowed us to become aware of the fact that the information is not enough. I mean, that the quality of teaching is not the essence and the substance of what we're offering, because there's something else, which is exactly what Jeremy was saying before. It's the milieu, it's the connection, it's the context, and this is something even wider, which goes beyond our schools. So we're somehow using a bigger capital, which is a capital made of people, made of spaces, made of cities. So we can, but let's assume that in the next future, for continuing to attract students, we will be somehow compelled to explicit this capital, to explicit the fact that if you want, you have to come to Central St. Martin, not because at Central St. Martin there are beautiful teachers, not only for that, but because in Central St. Martin's you will be involved within a specific network of implications, of people, of assets, which is invaluably individually specific, that you won't find anywhere else. And this where is a physical where. So I think that this is it helps us to understand and to measure and to map the material space where our schools are. So I think
but I think there's a warning about that, because it could be, I mean, to some extent, the elite institutions have survived on the kind of implicit narrative that if you come, you are going to be successful. So I went to Cambridge. I had a terrible education. It was a terrible education in the classic sense of learning, and yet I learned a lot in terms of social, mobility and blah, blah, blah. So I think one needs to be quite careful that you don't sort of just play out the elitist agenda of cultural capital, because it's quite easy to do that. And particularly, I'm head of a great arts institute, and without a doubt, many of our students come because of its cultural capital. But therefore, one needs to be very careful about acknowledging that it isn't just perpetuation of the status quo. But another point I want to get on to is to respond to something that was in your questions, but also in something you said, Alessandro, about the idea of the real, and the suggestion that architecture schools, through their physicality and their previous systems, have been engaging in the real in a meaningful manner. I would completely dispute that. I think that architecture schools' notion of the real is a complete fantasy. The fact you take your students to Venice for a week to look at a lagoon and then come back to Torino and everyone does this, some places much more extreme than others, is a complete fantasy. There's nothing real about that. And if there was any real within the way that architecture schools have been operating, why haven't they been dealing with climate? Why haven't they been dealing with politics? They've been operating in the whole of the modern project in a completely kind of fiction, where they think that if they take their students for 2 weeks to a altiplano in Chile, or a jungle in Peru, or whatever extreme sport the elite schools do, and they come back and then they draw pictures of the natives, that in some way that is engaging with the real. So I think that I don't see that the shift to the online is a shift away from the real. I'd suggest it's potentially a shift into the real, as long as we actually are honest with ourselves about what we've been doing in the past.
Thank you for the warning, Jeremy. I completely accept your criticism about my consideration, which was a little bit naive, and I finally agree with you. Thanks for having me given me this suggestion to stay with a different approach on the field work value, because I agree. You have convinced me immediately. So.
Well, I did a lecture at the Bartlett and I started it by showing where all their field trips were, and the more successful the studio was, the further they went from London.
Okay.
Yeah, successful in attracting students.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's typical also here, of course.
So basically, you're kind of an architecture school stroke travel agency. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're offering exotic travel.
It actually makes me think of maybe it's I'm borrowing from the Zizek quote of some sort, but the only thing worse than not doing anything is to perform, to pretend that you're doing something, in which case you take the space of actual action by performing the semblance of action. And yes. I think just as a small provocation, I'm still thinking about this context of, Jeremy, you were mentioning the neoliberal institution. Is there any hope for an institution such as yours to exit that paradigm in this, the reality that's, like you said, most students go there to perhaps perpetuate the artificial individuation of the brand, of the auteur, of the privileged kind of visionary that again, as we all know, no designer works in a vacuum, and yet architectural education is perpetuating these kind of individual projects and mastery in a way that I think is slightly disingenuous, perhaps even at times, because we all know it's not how it operates. So what would you, I mean, what are your thoughts on the possibility of exiting that possible framework?
Is it possible to exit the financial framework on which we are currently dependent? No.
I mean, the structural, this problem of the neoliberal, the reinforcement of neoliberal values starts from the very structure of these institutions, and students coming in there are very much aware that they're going there for the network and for their own brand.
No, I mean, it's where I'm deeply compromised, and my staff often pointed out to me. So my staff all went on strike, presumably against me, because I'm the manager. And there was a picture that went round, which was a picture of me, very critical of my, on the one hand, critique of some of the neoliberal systems, my critique of the establishment architectural profession, and then pointing out, well, you're running a very conservative institution, Jeremy. And yeah, I'm deeply compromised at that level, because the institutional structures are supported by a financial condition, and as it stands, without destroying St. St. Martin's, I have to abide by those financial structures. However, that doesn't mean that one shouldn't talk about loudly the values of that financial structure from a point of critique, but also other values which students, and I think we do this, by which students might and staff might enact their practice. So the fact that you are part of a financial structure which one is uncomfortable with, because it is dependent on the economic regimes, doesn't mean that one shouldn't at least have conversations about how one maneuvers within those in a critical manner. And I don't think that, I don't think we should be a business, we should abide by business school values because we are part of a business school financial system. Mm-hmm. But it's really difficult. It is really difficult, this one.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is also a little bit where my thinking goes, because I completely agree with you, and it's not to, this is a structural problem that all institutions that are fairly successful in this regime are facing. But I wonder whether this kind of, to define the role of the institution as one that instills personal values and sort of like an activist agenda is like one of the critiques that I usually have around design school is that it seems like it's turning students either into artists or into activists, but not always as designers. Like the ability to design institutions, to think of ways out that aren't simply like performing defiance, but actually like productively engaging with the forces that they disagree with is, I think, something that a lot of architecture schools have had maybe more trouble dealing with than some of the other institutions that are teaching different things.
Yeah, no, there's a real issue that, as it were, good activism leads to bad design. And in that you are throwing away what is actually should be really productive. So there's a real danger with that. And you see some schools going down that line in which a kind of virtuousness about their activism actually, I think, could be disempowering the students from what is central to the conversation we're having before, which is how do we, as spatial practitioners, designers, operate in these new conditions. So if you don't give, if all we talk about is a kind of political activism, but not the tools by which spatially or as designers we may engage as political activists, then we're really letting down our students. So I agree that and I've seen it, and you do see it, and you know, if I see another bloody urban farm in an architecture school, and you say an urban farm is a form of kind of virtuous kind of political activism, it isn't. So I think that we need to be honest with ourselves on that one, and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So one of my favorite quotes, which I think I probably did when I gave a lecture in Torino, but I'll do it again anyway, new audience, is from a English philosopher called Gillian Rose, not the geographer, philosopher, who before she died very young. For some reason, she got involved in community architecture. And the quote of hers, and she got very critical of a kind of very pure strand of community architecture, where architects were basically just there to be the pencil pusher on behalf of the community. And her quote is that the architect was demoted, but the people did not rise to power, because the architect was stripped of any kind of agency or design intelligence in the name of kind of knowledge being divested. And therefore the people had nothing to work with. And therefore I agree that one needs to keep hold of a kind of sense of what can we offer? What are the ways of thinking that we can offer within a new value-based system?
If I can simply add that, I would actually say that maybe maybe it's about having a new intuition about dealing with the world, rather than like reducing this to the like moralistic. You're a good person, therefore your design is righteous. This is but
definitely. Yes. Okay. Maybe we can also try to widen this dialogue. At least me, I would like to make a step back, or leaving the floor, my floor at least, to Valeria and Edoardo, because they prepared first this meeting, and then of course we can also follow the questions if the people who are now in contact with us at this virtual roundtable could also make some intervention and make questions to our hosts. So I don't know, Edoardo or Valeria, if you want to ask something and to give another step to this discussion. Valeria.
Hi. Yeah, first of all, I didn't take the floor before, so thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate this conversation, which has been great, and it was really interesting. I think what I would like to add to the conversation is perhaps a small provocation, let's say. So up to now, we have been engaging in, let's say, the pars destruens. So we have been sort of unpacking the problem from a number of very interesting perspectives, especially the the last part of the conversation was really interesting. But how would you approach, let's say, a transition towards a pars construens? So how do we go from here? Where do we go from here? So Jeremy was talking about the problem of, say, the institutions being entangled in this really complex system of financial, economic, and cultural systems. So do you think that this is this contingency gives us an apt moment to discuss these things in a more operative manner than we could do before? So do you think that this is the moment for actually take action in some of the directions that you were talking about? And if so, is it only on a rhetorical level, or because some of the mechanisms that are being disrupted by the, let's say, crisis, with all the quotes, unquotes that we need to put, give us, let's say, the slack space we need to change something in the system?
Again, that's a really good question. I mean, the fear that certainly we have in the UK is that what's very interesting at the moment is that the right-wing think tanks that have been supporting the government and writing our present government's policies, you know, so our present government policies are not written by politicians, they're written by ideologues in think tanks. What's very interesting is that the think tanks have been, the right-wing think tanks, and they are extreme right-wing think tanks, market-led think tanks, have been almost completely silent in the face of COVID. And the reason for that is they have no tools to respond with. So the only tools that have been brought out is a return to forms of state-led intervention, which have been necessary. But the real problem and the real fear is that the right are just waiting for it to be over and then to intervene in the most extreme form of disaster capitalism. And that they've been waiting for this moment of weakness to say the only way out is an extreme form of market-led intervention. It's happening already through Dominic Cummings in the UK. It's inevitably happening in Brazil. It's inevitably happening in the States. And therefore, this is the moment. This is an absolutely key moment of how do we resist that change? So that is at a kind of macro level. At the level of an institution, it could happen in the same way. At a practical level, we'll adapt. There will be more online learning. There will be better systems where we've learned from what's happening already, and we'll adapt our pedagogy in an important manner, and I think we should do that. In terms of the real sense of your argument of, do I think structural change is going to come out at an institutional level? I think we have to keep on talking about that, because the only alternative is a form of kind of disaster capitalism played out at institutional level, i.e. the bureaucracies will intervene again. And I guess that the Italian university system probably has the most bureaucratic sense of institution of anyone I've come across. Actually, I went to Germany. That was pretty tough as well. But can we actually resist those incredibly bureaucratic procedures at our institutes in order to effect change? I think those discussions. I mean, this discussion I had with my students, you know, just before I came on, say, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to have flat hierarchy? And I said, well, I hadn't actually been asked that question. I think we all need to ask those questions, because otherwise we will just go into a pragmatic solution of, yeah, we'll have better onlining. Yeah, we'll have a bit less physical presence. But this seems to be the moment when we need to have exactly that discussion that your question asks. I think Nicolay is in a easier position because Strelka has the ability to remake itself on an annual basis. So I think that we watch to see what you do, Nicolay, so that you can show us.
Well, I think I think to be fair, I think you're absolutely right. The freedom that we have, given the fact that our institutional framework it's a double-edged sword in some ways. Like, it allows us to let's say, mess up in different ways. And I would really be it's important to take my comments as in, I definitely don't think that Strelka is a model to replace other forms of education. If anything, I think that we probably need more kind of institutions that are operating at a scale maybe either under or above the university. And I think maybe it's about revisiting first principles in education, which kind of assumes that people don't know anything, go to school to learn something, and then they know something, and then they go out of school to act. That's a very simplistic way of thinking about what education means, which is kind of based on duration. The longer and the more degrees you have, the more educated you are. Maybe replacing that with a system based on intervals, or maybe like cyclical relationships to institutions, as in our case, where, as I mentioned, our programs are cyclical, where students for a particular year becomes tutor for the next year, become experts, and then maybe go back, become students once again. It is pointing towards a solution. Something else about the think tank aspect of this. I also have been following the situation in the UK, in North America. Russia, of course, we have our own problems, which I don't need to go through now. But I think institutions should see the design project of institutional design be one of the outcomes, and think about their studios possibly as, you know, the skeleton or the early stages of a platforms that are able to influence and able to push basically design, not at the end of a so-called predefined process where we have briefs and designers are meant to either acknowledge without criticism or critique in an activism form, but really push design upstream to the level of designing the problem themselves. And therefore think tanks, policy making, and you know, these types of practices are really the ones that we should be encouraging. So the project of Strelka has been really the prototyping of new practices and the prototyping of a field of design. And I think a lot of institutions actually, even if they operate under different institutional regimes, have the power to set up that as an outright agenda, not spitting out experts or individual kind of units of creativity, but actually developing networks and fostering these networks way past the point where they exited the institutions. So keeping the product being this kind of ongoing engagement with the cohort is really, I think, something that institutions should be taking more seriously.
Yeah, I liked your earlier comments about how journalists should learn from designers and see their whole field as a kind of spatial field as well. And I think one of the things that the creative sector has not done well in relation to COVID and in relation to climate, even more in relation to climate actually, is to engage. We haven't actually said what we can offer. And therefore the conversation gets dominated by a kind of mechanistic worldview, single worldview. And the mechanistic single worldview of the modern project is hopeless at dealing with uncertainty. It's hopeless at dealing with contingency. Whereas the word contingency has been used a lot, but one of the things that designers do is to navigate through uncertainty, not to find a kind of certain solution, because I don't believe, you know, climate and COVID are not problems to be solved. You can't solve it. It's ridiculous. They're conditions to be made sense of. And in that, that's what designers do. Therefore, in relation to the conversation about Valeria put out about the redesign of institutions, we should be much more confident about going in with our own skills and talking to our, well, I talk to myself, I suppose, but we need to be talking beyond the institution about what we can offer to the world beyond the designing of a few nice buildings or whatever, i.e. ways of thinking in terms of policy, ways of thinking in terms of new spatial relationships, but ways of thinking also in the face of uncertainty and contingency. Because the scientists, we need to work with the scientists on this, but the scientists can't do that. And so that kind of confidence is something that we need to articulate more. There's a very good book written by Amitav Ghosh, who's a novelist, who is very critical of his fellow novelists for not addressing the climate emergency. And he says, you know, the climate emergency is a cultural crisis, and therefore a crisis of the imagination as well. And that kind of sense of the imagination engaging, and I wouldn't be embarrassed by using the word imagination, I really wouldn't. Or Nicolay used the word intuition. Yeah, that these sense are positive things that is what we should be talking about within design schools and talking about with confidence, because we're facing scenarios which are unheard of, and therefore the scenarios that we need in order to think about the way through these uncertainties need imagination, they need intuition, they need ways of thinking which the mechanistic mindset can't deliver. And in that's where we need to be on the front foot. So I completely agree with Nicolay about, yeah, we can say to the world what we can offer, but the world also needs to understand their own positions in relation to spatial and design and other ways of thinking.
Yeah, I thank you, Jeremy, for this also, because actually this confidence maybe is also a sort of confidence in the possibility of designing and constructing institutions, our own institutions, but also the institutional consistence of the world we are living in.
Yep.
So, for instance, because we had a talk last week with some students and Andrea Branzi. You know Andrea Branzi, who is the radical architect. Is now more than 80 years old, and we were talking with him about the destiny of the university and teaching and so on. So something not so the same thing, but similar to what we're talking about now. And of course, and he said this thing. He said that in his perspective, in his opinion, of course, the university was basically useless. So he said, I was taught in Florence in 1966. We were Archizum. We were making good things because our professors were useless. So in the void, we had the possibility to go beyond. So the lack of proposal was a good thing. To be into a weak school was a good opportunity. So of course, it's a sort of paradox. It's a radical, okay? So it's but there's something interesting in this. I mean, because he can suggest us that maybe we have to form, which is a paradox, form self-taught persons somehow. People also I was thinking about this because Nicolay before he was mentioning something about the profiling of the student, how we can teach people to go into the world and to be capable of being architects, to having a profession, a practice, or something like that. So maybe becoming a self-taught person is a good point. It's a good project for an architecture school. And as Andrea Branzi said, but the difference from Andrea Branzi, in my opinion, maybe is that we need the institution. That kind of consideration is too much anti-institutional. It doesn't keep any faith in that. Instead, I would say that in the sense you are meaning the possibility of to have intuition and institution together, let's say. The institution not as something which is fixed, but as a sort of continuous transformation of context could be a good thing. For instance, in Torino, the institution of Politecnico is even bigger than the institution of the city. We have 35,000 students, and with the other university, we have 100,000 students, over 900,000 people, inhabitants in the city. So, you know, there is a city in the city, and the power and also the budget of the school or the two universities is bigger than many of the public enterprises you can find here. Okay, so there's a sort of unbalance, but which becomes also sort of a responsibility, if you want, towards this, because we are making institutional things, we are designing institution from the inside to the outside of our context. So that kind of opportunity we were considering before in saying what we are offering, it's something that we can affect, we can influence, we can even create in some parts. So we can say that our challenge as an institution is not just to form people, but also to affect the world we are inside, where we are living in as a school, as a university, as a group of people and actors. I don't know. This could be maybe for me I would say the explicit suggestion that comes from your words to the question.
Could I add something to this, Alessandro? Because I just want to like clarify maybe to myself, like, no, I don't want for a second to claim that I actually am quite critical of this idea that the self-taught person, the self-taught practitioner, you know, like just because we are designing institutions doesn't mean we're doing it properly. Like I think that's when I mentioned this notion of intuition, it really means education. It means getting educated to think beyond our most intuitive reflexes, because we're as human beings, we can understand, you know, objects and things, but understanding relationship between things is something that's much more difficult. And that is also a design, like this design of supply chains, the design of infrastructure, the design of what, you know, Keller Easterling calls active form, as opposed to object form, is something that, yes, someone is doing. That is a design project. It doesn't mean that we are doing it well. I think architects have to stop claiming that they're good at designing these things and actually learning to be good at designing these things by expanding their educational repertoire to actually being able to address those things that we're talking about. I think that all schools of architecture should be looking at things that, as you were saying, Jeremy, that acknowledge the contingency, acknowledge complexity, and find ways of dealing with it that acknowledge basically impact but not control. Like that's design reflex is something that is a fact, but we aren't very good at acknowledging that as designers. It's much easier to be like Virgil Abloh or someone who can design something than actually designing a supply chain, which is someone did design that. In fact, it doesn't mean it can be designed differently and better.
Okay. No, if I can have a few things. First of all, it's a very nice conversation and very nice to feel to be on a hedge in order to destroy or change our own paradigm institutions. But it's really nice because we have the possibility of change starting from the contingency we are living. And so it's great, this kind of debate. But listening your conversation, I had one question referring especially to the main topic of our meeting, that was about the way we move online. Okay, so it was out of class. And when we were thinking about some questions for you, we were in some way believing a rhetoric that education through online systems and tools can have the possibility to be a little bit more egalitarian and reach all the levels of society, and spreading something that the institutional thresholds or borders were like limiting this possibility. Now opening up very incredible possibility. But at the same time, I have a design question for you that is related to design, that is accessibility. So how these new contingencies declining a way of assessing the real and assessing the virtual, like assessing the real means also how can I access to some institution or the same networks that Jeremy and Alessandro were talking about before, that leave students to hold a degree and say, okay, I belong from here. So how we can design different way of assessing real and virtual due to the contingents we are living right now, because the accessibility is something that is really related to some rights, social rights and political, decision making.
Jeremy, would you like to go, since I just went, and I partly answered it as well, but maybe.
I didn't, just phrase the question again. Phrase the question.
In terms of, it's like having the virtual seems to give us the possibility to spread knowledge through our institute very easily. But there is a problem of accessibility. I give you an example. In Italy, there was a big debate for the primary schools that, for example, all the children hold a computer or a tablet or a tool. So are they still stakeholders or users since they are children? So what kind of accessibility we are designing for the future?
Yeah. Well, this is where I'm going to sound old-fashioned, I think, because yeah, the online world does allow one to, as I like the idea of spreading knowledge, and to reach people that otherwise you couldn't. So it can give you knowledge in one sense, which is a set of facts, a set of skills.
We have lost Jeremy, maybe. We have.
Yes.
It's frozen somehow. Okay. Yes. So if Jeremy maybe is, I don't know if we lost his connection or somehow. So maybe. Yes. Okay, Jeremy, can you hear us again? Okay, now we see you again. You have just to unlock your microphone. Unmute yourself. Okay. Perfect.
Okay. So where did you get to? I was talking about how there are elements of education that can be spread. And of course, what is going to happen very quickly is that the elite institutions will marketize their online experience in certain fields. So I could imagine that happening in some bits of the humanities, some bits of sciences, etc. But I would try, and I can't quite articulate, and maybe you can help me, about why design can't just go, because I think it always needs to come back into a conversation. And in coming back into a conversation, you can't spread it in the way that you were potentially suggesting. But I may be wrong there. I don't believe if architecture can be taught in a mechanistic manner, then none of us would have jobs, and B, I don't think that, well, you wouldn't need architecture school, would you? So that if it could be taught in a mass mechanistic manner. So we need to define why it can't be taught in that manner.
I would agree, actually, that there seems to be this impression around, design populism that, unlike every other discipline, the discipline of design could be just like people show up in a room and figure it out through participatory collaboration or quote unquote, which obviously is part of the process. But to reduce design to this would be actually it would be counterproductive, I would think. I also think that there's the reason why I'm a bit skeptical about this notion that to maximize the conversation by spreading it to the larger possible audience. It just seems to me that it's another type of censorship through noise. Speaking from a Russian context, like the one of the things that we did see through the COVID situation is that every museum, every school, every institution started multiplying online content and producing things that essentially were completely impossible to follow in the whole stream of the whole sea of, and we're producing it at a pace where I wonder whether it was even necessary, and whether again they needed the audience more than the audience needed them. Maybe since we're still early days into this kind of, for lack of a better word, hybrid relationship between the digital space of broadcasting and distribution versus the more physical space of the production, maybe through a few cycles we will learn through our mistakes what is worth being broadcast to the largest possible public, and in what terms, because yeah, so far, other than the kind of celebration of design, quote unquote, through quantity, I'm not sure if that's actually, that seems to be more part of the problem than part of the solution, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of hiding away the nuggets of content that are worth looking at through the kind of multiplication of sources. You froze a little bit, so I'm not sure if everyone caught that, but that was.
No, I mean, of course, we cannot just embrace this utopian scenario in which the horizontality of connections allows us to communicate architectural knowledge everywhere to everybody, and it's not, maybe that's not that, there's nothing interesting in that direction, but yet still there are some kind of aspects which deal with the accessibility. For instance, we could give our lectures for free to everybody, for instance, and we don't, but somehow we will starting to do this. We can go on YouTube and attend lectures from everywhere right now, and this is something which didn't happen maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago even. So the possibility of accessing the information of the highest degree of education in the best place of the world is now accessible, something that we can do actually. And maybe we can do even more. We will be able to do even more in the next years. And this experience can suggest us about that this possibility can be enlarged, maybe. But at the same time, it won't affect, I think, the way we conceive the institution and the teaching and the implication it has on our students and the profiling of professional formation. And this is a point. But on the other side, I think that there is not only the teaching issue, there's also the research issue. And on this side, maybe this kind of communication and horizontality that we can even discover right now with this kind of dialogues could be much more interesting. I would say that the internationalization, for instance, of research in Torino in the last year, in the last 15 years in my university, for instance, has deeply changed the way we conceive research around the architectural project. We have started to do completely different things because of different extension of our dialogues out of the national borders, and trying to even to criticize ourselves in our paradigms, and confronting with people like you, like Jeremy, like, I don't know, Albena, Janeva in Manchester, or people from Stockholm and Germany. And it was something completely different from what we were doing before. When I was a PhD student 16 years ago, I remember that the context of the same place in the same school was completely different. So maybe on the research edge of architecture, this kind of horizontality will affect maybe few people, because we are few people in the world dealing with this kind of things on the academic side, but it is an opportunity which could change profoundly the way we intend and we practice research around architecture and architectural design especially. I don't know what you think about this, if there is some kind of perception of change in this context.
I think it's possible.
This Italian feeling.
It seems, yeah, it seems maybe it's my Bulgarian pessimistic nature, but I actually, I guess it remains to be seen whether, you know, advice or research is always only as good as who is willing to follow it. And I liked kind of Jeremy's point earlier about the think tanks that were very influential during the time of stability and are simply waiting for the opportunity to pounce again, because again, perhaps they operate on different terms than argumentative research. Like, as one of my professors used to say, an argument is always a plea, whereas a pitch is always a gift. Being able to, offering ideas in frameworks that are different from quote unquote research is something that I think designers always do, and do it kind of intuitively, as we were speaking earlier. So maybe the push to the multiplication of research and the multiplication of content will lead to better outcomes, possibly, but I wouldn't say that this is a de facto given. Maybe, but I don't know what anyone else thinks. Jeremy, I think that you're muted.
I think that, I mean, I've done quite a lot of these sessions in the last 3 weeks, lots and lots actually. And I found them, apart from what we haven't done, and maybe in the last 10 minutes we're now ready to open up the room, is that I found them, people are just much more open and engaging than the traditional conference or seminar forum. And I'd be really, really glad to see the traditional conference going, not only for reasons of carbon and climate, but because of the inbuilt hierarchies of the conference. You know, I am invited, keynote speaker, you know, there I am, people, you know, respect me, blah, blah, blah. And I just think that what these kind of events do, or should try to do, is to get rid of that and in a much more open, so that I can speak. You know, I've probably said things which I wouldn't have said in a conference setting, because I feel more relaxed. I can't see you. I can't really see your reaction to me, and you just do it. And Nicolay said some things in the same way, which I don't think that, you know, there's a fantastic thing he said, which is we should acknowledge impact and not control, and lots of other things, which I've learned a lot from, which I don't think I would have got, which I think are forms of research, by the way, which I wouldn't have got through the traditional forums. So I think you're right, but we need to think a bit smarter about why there are 24 other people in the room who are passive. That's not good.
That's a very good provocation, Jeremy. Thank you for this, because this would be the last part of this wonderful meeting with you. We still have something like 20 minutes. It would be great from the students and from the people who are just listening so far to let us see her or him, and to take the word and say us something, because of course this is a very good opportunity also to encounter these two colleagues and scholars, and you can ask them a lot of things, and I'm sure also you could also witness your condition about the many things we are discussing. I see a lot of students from Torino as well, and I would really glad if some of them could tell us something about the many wide range of issues we have touched in this open dialogue. So it's not just you don't have to be prepared to anything. You can just share with us your perspective, even on your personal experience of these months, even just telling us something about if we are right or wrong about the many things we have touched right now. So please try to, you can also, if you are too shy, you can start by writing in the chat lines something, and then we can try to share with you something of your consideration. Now, okay, I know that it won't be so easy to keep people out of their hidden cameras, but maybe there's something. Okay.
I would like possibly observations.
Sure.
First of all, I want to thank you for this talk. I am a lecturer at the University of Malta, Masters in Architecture coordinator. And first of all, thank you for really, I'm supposed to send the report to the faculty board meeting on learning teaching methods going forward. So now I have all the notes, so thank you for that. And I wanted to kind of compare and contrast maybe what happened here and what, especially since we're an institution that students don't pay. They actually get a small stipend every month. So this kind of relationship that you were talking about and then Jeremy was referring to is a bit different. Also, in a way, we can't organize trips. We are the only university, one university in Malta, one course of architecture. So everything is one. So students, so if you want to study architecture, you are with us. You have kind of no option. So in that sense, you are not allowed really to set up obligatory site visits far away, unless you're certain that everyone can afford it. So it's a bit different than what you were saying about Bartlett and kind of, but then we also depend on non-EU students. Kind of, this is where kind of the fees are generated. So then this is discussion. Okay, so 2 points. How was it working and what the students kind of contributed or exposed in this new setup, I think was really amazing how there was this exposing obsoleteness of certain rituals that we were following in teaching, in living, things like commuting, possibly, our typologies of apartments, which are bedrooms, living, sitting, dining, that really become to kind of the 20th century. And it really becomes like, do we need all this? Can we work from home? Can we, do we need to go to gym and things like that? So I think it really was this kind of understanding the new normal. And I think the students are more understanding of the new normal. And I don't think they're maybe like the older people feeling that we are going back to anything that was there before. So that was in a way, a learning curve for at least me as an educator to understand new set of circumstances. And then then really this notion of teaching students to navigate through uncertainties just becomes obvious, right? There is no normal we could prepare them for anymore. So that was really something that just this discussion made clear. And the second observation is like, I want to make is like, what do we offer? As you said, I guess in possibly it's collaborations and kind of a studio we did this semester was not going to Lesotho, but doing a project in Africa, in Lesotho. And then you start seeing, like, without going there, how much you can learn about the context. And that was, then it kind of, I don't know if that would be considered, is that close to reality? Is it also because it was a lot of kind of engaging with the locals through WhatsApp messaging, a lot of Google Earth going through the streets. So then you start saying, let's say, would a week in Venice or be more realistic, giving more reality of the context than maybe spending 4 months chatting on WhatsApp and asking residents of what they need. So then this kind of collaboration maybe of not necessarily traveling somewhere similar, like Darren was saying, conferences, but still establishing strong collaboration with outside your context. I think that maybe they are more doable now than actually, since traveling might be out of the question. So maybe what do we have to offer in terms of networking is possibly what kind of school, what kind of set of collaborations can a school, again, it's kind of networking on a larger network between the students, but also meeting people that the school can bring people from outside that students can interact with. I thought maybe that could be something to be offered if kind of fancy traveling studios is not an option. So really, no question, but just kind of observation from a slightly different context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina. I wonder, okay, there is another question from the audience, from Danny. Perhaps Danny would like to take the mic, to open the mic and ask the question directly.
Okay,
Hello?
we can read the question from Danny, of course, which is a very direct question, I would say. Is saying the school receive financial asset. In exchange, traditionally doesn't transfer only intellectual or cultural asset, but most likely social asset, which honestly is not the case in this emergency period, or who knows for how long. In real spaces, classrooms, students share real workshops. They experience teamwork. They meet their future business partners. Students don't learn only from teachers, but also from themselves. Asset is something included in a traditional offer. How do you think to substitute the sociality asset in this new scenario? So maybe Jeremy, you want to answer?
Yeah, it's the question I'm being asked on a daily basis, which is why the fully online scenario isn't sustainable. For many of the reasons we've talked about, for many of the reasons of to do, as you put so clearly there, to do with sociality, to do with the necessity to be together, to do with the networks that are formed. So I don't think we wouldn't be able to survive, I don't think, any of our institutions in a fully online world, for many of the reasons that we put together, not least of which is what you've just said in terms of this notion of the social asset. And we've been forced through lockdown and through this social distancing to go fully online, but I don't believe we will be able to survive solely online in the future for exactly the reasons that you've put.
Nicolay, maybe are you talking? You are okay.
Sorry, once again, big Zoom beginner mistake. Yes, I completely agree, of course. And as I was mentioning in the beginning, the reason why I think we've managed to adapt to this current situation and finish our program, which by the way, just to as a tangent, we were lucky enough to even have that option of not doing it. Like, this was a real conversation. Do we actually need to continue the program, or can we just stop it and restart next year? This should be an option available on the table. And if it isn't, like, it's also a testament to the institutional frameworks that we have. But yes, the reason why we managed to continue our program is because we actually established a strong link, a strong personal link that our students felt like they were deprived, quote unquote, as they were kind of as the situation changed, and therefore the internal motivation to not let each other down and not let their peers down was really what made this collaboration successful to some extent right now. If it was a fully online program, like I was mentioning earlier, I think it would continue to perpetuate this idea that you are a singular empty vessel that is in need of filling from professors, rather than being a part of a collective that, given the right framework, operate as a productive machine or think tank or let's say group of people who learn from one another. So yes, that distinction to me is this is probably the main lesson from a lot of for a lot of the institutions right now, that the formats between digital and physical have to be taught together, and whichever if some things work better online, they have to be dialed up, and the things that work better offline also need to be dialed up in order to take advantage of both fronts simultaneously.
Yeah, for instance, my students, maybe, yes, there is Suhashini. Okay, maybe you have to unmute. Please go. Yeah.
Hi, I would like to first of all thank this opportunity from sitting halfway across the world and being able to listen to this. It has really been eye-opening. So my question is, so I am a final year student doing my bachelor's in architecture, and I've taken up my thesis topic in how there'll be new design paradigms that will be birthed by COVID-19 and the pandemic. So there are obviously many potential impacts COVID-19 can take in terms of land use or urban density or telecommunicating energy resource, anything of that sort. But from our previous lessons that we have learned from former pandemics, like the 1918 influenza and how it created a sanitarium or any other new typology that it gave birth to. So I would like to so my question would be, how would that impact in public space, since like the human lifestyle and the very essence of public interaction is between humans, and then this whole scenario gives rise to a problem where you have to invert interaction while still keeping the spirit of interaction alive, in that sense, if you know what I mean.
It's a really good question, and it's quite interesting how part of the architectural community have already come along and said, this is the solution. And the solution which they're coming up with essentially is a return to a kind of, as you've just articulated it, a kind of post-1918 pandemic modernism of sort of, but it's got curves on this time because it's a bit more contemporary. So that it's all to do with smooth spaces and clean surfaces. I mean, it's rubbish, frankly. Of course, that's not going to solve the pandemic. So you can't solve the pandemic through design in that way. You could probably mitigate it, but the pandemic, as we've seen, it's perfectly possible to deal with the pandemic through strong social interventions, which are not spatial interventions. Your more important point, which no one has begun to address that I've read about, is what happens to the public sphere as public space in which the notions of democracy, the notions of public interaction, the notions of equality are kind of still very much attached to the notion of public space. And no one has really dealt with what happens in a social distanced world, what happens to those kind of public spaces. So I think your question, I can't answer it, but I think it's an important question to ask, because how do we rediscover those forms of communal life which have been taken away from us? Is there the possibility, because this doesn't cut it, these kind of these kind of interactions online clearly a poor substitute for some other methods of public interaction. And so I think that the important thing is you keep asking the question. I don't have the answer, but it's not smooth space.
Thank you very much.
Whatever Patrick Schumacher may tell us.
Yes, and hopefully we don't start with Patrick Schumacher as the reference for how to get out of our current predicaments. But yes, I actually think that another point here, and I think maybe it joins this other question on the chat, which I think is also quite good, about the value of public space in a way that I maybe interpret the question, is that there's something nice about the ability to have like non-functional. Just to give you an example, the Strelka Institute is really not so much a school as many people know it as a bar. It's basically like it's built around a social space, which is basically a bar, a terrace, and a kind of open courtyard. And the benefit of thinking of space without function is one where you can gossip, you can hang out, you can think about things in a non-goal oriented way. And maybe this is one of the shortcomings of this kind of digital platforms, in my opinion, is that I'm convinced that had we had this conversation in person, of course, there's the intimacy and the kind of physical proximity that we've all, evolved as human beings to kind of appreciate. But there's also the sense that you don't have to be performing for posteriority. The fact that the conversation happens in a there and now, and that's something that unfortunately these kind of formats remove from the equation. The fact that we are all know that we are being recorded and have to say something genuine and profound, I think is either it's maybe kind of early days and we have still not managed to root this impulse out, or maybe this is one of the true values of public space, is the ability of saying meaningless things and being able to go about our business without having to perform for the timeline. And I think that this is maybe one of the key components around online education as well. As you were saying, Jeremy, one of the benefits of having a conversation online is that more voices are being added. One of the negative aspects is that some people may not be as open to speak up because they feel they have nothing profound to say. So that's something I think that we should still be cognizant of here.
Which is a question on the chat, which is why there are these silences. And I'm afraid the silences also come because we set up quite a traditional format of three men talking in a kind of quite, three confident, articulate men talking to a group of silent people. And I think that we need to find better methods by which we can set up occasions in teaching and in conferences, which allow more voices to speak. In some cases, I've had amazing kind of interaction actually in some of these things, but it needs more. I think it needs all of us to think more cleverly about how best to organize these events so that it's not three men talking, as it were.
Yes, you're definitely right, Jeremy. And we need to...
We accept the critique, yes.
Well, no, I mean...
That actually, no.
I've enjoyed it, and I think it's been a really useful thing, but the question from, sorry, I can't see the name because I'm doing this on my iPad. For the question from EN is actually a critique of us all too, of the conversation not coming through in a manner which brings everyone together.
Yes, totally. And actually, before Nicolay was speaking about Keller Easterling and active form, and as I remember it, the concept of active form builds on the concept of disposition now. So we could actually read this whole thing, this whole contingency as a changing set of dispositions that forces us to, let's say, realize that these things that we are experiencing, these limitations have been institutionalized in a super rapid way. And we have to come to terms with that. I was reading that in Singapore, one person was sent to death on Zoom. It was, judged, tried, and sent to death on Zoom. So these things are becoming so rapidly part of the institutional, national, and supranational systems that we really have to understand what kind of disposition they allow for and kind of change they allow for. There is one more question from Denny. Nowadays, we're able to substitute physical social spaces with digital ones. The technology allows, why the school can't yet? I'm talking about proprietary software. There is plenty in the market, or comprehensive apps that should be developed for education institutes. New generations already are using new tools. If university can't reach this tech, someone else will do. Google, Tencent, we really want to be educated by them.
Good point. Which university are you talking about? They're talking about Polytechnico or somewhere else? I mean, yeah, I mean, what happened when COVID struck is that every university was not ready, and therefore the other ways of teaching and the other forms of software and whatever, we had to, all of us had to reinvent ourselves in the space of 4 weeks. And so we were not up to speed on many of the softwares that you're talking about and whatever. And one of the things that we've got to learn is to share good practice, so that there are very good pieces of software which bits of Central St. Martin's are using, but other bits haven't even found. So that I think you're right, because otherwise the whole thing will be driven by new forms of technology, will clearly create new forms of social interaction and therefore of social content. And that's a kind of classic technical determinist thing. We're in it already, obviously. You know, we're all completely observed and controlled by Google and everyone else. So, but I think your point is right. I don't know which university particularly you're talking about there. I hope it's not me.
From our perspective at Strelka, actually, we've been experimenting with various digital kind of archiving mechanisms and digital setups because a lot of our faculty isn't based in Moscow. So the transition wasn't as painful, or maybe we were better prepared to just, like I mentioned earlier, dial up some aspects of the program while diminishing others. Just on that point, I think that the way that we try to think of ourselves as an education institute is really to think of ourselves as a type of platform for content in the same way that Google, Tencent, and other are platforms. And the kind of institutional format that platforms allow is, and also why they're so profitable in the case of these companies, is that they allow both what we call user surplus for the users, but also platform surplus for the platform. So the platform is actually made more useful for the users through continued use, but also for the institution, the ability to kind of learn from use as well is something that is like put to practice as it occurs. So I don't think that necessarily having an open source software is a solution to the problem that you're mentioning here. But I definitely think that we shouldn't shy away from understanding how these processes actually operate, and learning, again, the affordances and dispositions that are available through them. There's a lot to learn from Google and Tencent beyond simply being critical of their methods. It's not to say that we are encouraging the privatization of everything through their current formats, but I think if we learn how these tools operate beyond the interface that they allow us, we can actually start treating them as an open design project and maybe thinking of institutions of education having a more active role in reshaping how they function.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to go because one of these, it's really weird. I won't live my life to minutes these days to get into the next room, as it were. So I'd scheduled it for 2 hours and the 2 hours is up.
Yes, sure.
Definitely.
You have to end this beautiful conversation. It's time to say you hello and to thank you again for this. So maybe Valeria and Eduardo can get the floor and end this meeting for us.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you very much for your time. It was a great conversation, and we really hope to continue the conversation. So our group Telearchitettura is building an archive of ways in which institutions and educational practices are dealing with the contingency and trying to pull some of the threads that are coming up. So definitely, we really hope to continue the conversation with all the things that came up during this one. And again, thank you so much for your time and for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you for the questions. The questions are great. And the provocations. So that was very useful. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Ciao.
Ciao.
Okay, hope to see you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you soon. Bye.